Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Jaclyn Siano. I am a client director here at Inspired Instruction, and this month's webinar that I'm hosting is Closing the Literacy Gap for Secondary Students. So again, thank you for joining. A couple of quick things before we get started. One, you will have access to this recording after the webinar is over, so you can rewatch it, you can share it, whatever you'd like to do. It will be on our website. And secondly, within the next couple of days, you will be getting a resource sheet emailed to you that will have a lot of these templates and other activities that I'm going to be sharing today. So again, welcome. Thank you for spending your afternoon with me, and let's get started. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to be discussing during this webinar today. Really, we're going to be focusing on middle school and high school literacy gap issues. So what are the root causes? What are classroom strategies that we can be using to address those root causes? And then what are some school-wide strategies we can be using for improving literacy across the board? So my first big point is literacy is not just an ELA issue. Before I even jump into that, I also want to mention you can absolutely use the Q&A if you have any questions as I go forward. My colleague Anne-Marie Lawrence is here, and she will be manning that for me and answering your questions as we go. So feel free to use the Q&A button as needed. All right, so literacy is not just an ELA issue. We do not get master literacy, students who are masters in literacy or all reading on or above grade level if we just focus on literacy in the English language arts classroom. So the strategies that I'm going to be sharing today, I made very sure that they are applicable to all content areas and that they are usable in all content areas, not just your ELA classrooms. So let's start by looking at one of the root causes of literacy gaps, especially in the secondary classrooms: interrupted instruction and unfinished learning. So literacy gaps a lot of times can stem from disruptions in that foundational skill development. So depending on what your experience is with ELA and with different grade levels, you may or may not have seen this. This is called Scarborough's reading rope. Dr. Scarborough was a leading researcher of early language development. She developed this reading rope in the early 90s, and the goal was to help parents understand these are all the things that your students need to master in order to become proficient readers. So why is this important when we're talking about secondary students? Typically, younger students are taught all those things on the bottom, right? The sight recognition, decoding, all those basic skills. However, sometimes due to interrupted instruction or unfinished learning, that gets missed, or it just doesn't stick as well as it should have when they were in elementary school. So it is important that at the secondary level, we are still doing instruction on these areas, especially through word work. So older students may still need that foundational skill support. And we know that if there's early gaps in the reading instruction, in the literacy instruction, that it can absolutely affect text comprehension as they get older. So it's important to know that unfinished learning does not equal inability to learn, that students can learn, secondary students can make big, jumps in their literacy skills as long as we're looking at it through the correct lens of what they need. So interrupted instruction is another thing that we often see by behavior. Right? So if students had interrupted instruction or they're missing those foundational literacy skills, they might be the ones who are guessing at words when they're trying to read out loud. They avoid reading out loud. They struggle reading out loud. They give complete surface responses to the text. They have poor spelling. There's obvious phonics gaps. They can listen well, but the reading comprehension piece, especially independently, is lacking. So it's important to recognize that these behaviors are literacy signals, not always disengagement. So being able to provide that secondary foundational support can help decrease some of these behaviors that are really just a product of interrupted instruction or lack of foundational skills. So let's talk about some classroom strategies. Specifically, when we're talking about the foundational skills that some secondary students might be lacking. Word decoding, even though that's part of that primary section of the reading rope, some kids might still need support with that. So phonics instruction, straight up, systematic phonics may have stopped in elementary school, but older kids still need direct instruction, especially on multisyllabic words. So we can do that through a variety of ways. We can do, word analysis. We can do a bunch of different activities that I'm going to show you shortly, word walls, things like that. It's not just giving the kids packets of vocabulary words and say, here, study them, and we're going to give you a test. We want them to engage in those vocabulary words to help with those word decoding skills. So if you look, especially when you're looking at domain-specific academic vocabulary in science, especially, and math, there's some high-impact word types for secondary students, especially those with Greek and Latin roots, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. And then, words that just in general secondary students struggle with are the ones in that bottom box. So one of the things you can do as a teacher, regardless of your content area, is make a word wall that really highlights multisyllabic words that are specific to your content area. So in terms of some statistics and why this is so important for secondary students, 60% of English words have Greek or Latin origins, and 90% of multisyllabic academic words have Greek or Latin origins. So when we're talking about middle school and high school, specifically in the content areas, math, science, social studies, the arts, they're going to be coming across these words in text. So it's very important that they have the skills to decode these words, especially compound words. So one of the things we can do, regardless of your content area, is teach the ologies. So if you need a little refresher, if you're not necessarily an English person, etymology is the study of word origins, and morphology is the study of word parts and meanings. So students, even at the secondary level, benefit from direct instruction based on this. So systematic instruction of what are root words? And then what does that mean when we have to come across a word that we don't know when we're reading? So you can absolutely incorporate different routines into your classes, such as a word of the day or a word of the week. You can have interactive anchor charts. The goal is multiple exposure to these types of words over time. And that will absolutely help predict how well your students will comprehend what they're reading. We know that engagement increases when students practice, collaboratively, and they're encouraged to, use root words. You know what this root means. Therefore, what can you assume that this big word that you've never seen before in this textbook means? So academic vocabulary definitely can be challenging for all levels of students, including secondary ed students, but we can directly instruct morphology and etymology and give them the tools they need to figure it out. So one of the things that you're going to be getting in your resource packet after the end of this webinar is the word of the week, Greek and Latin root word routines. So this is an activity that we created, and it's two parts. The first couple of pages is explicit, what do I do as the teacher to teach Greek and Latin roots to students. And you can do one root per week. So obviously you could pick one that is specific to your content area, and I'll talk more about that. So, if you're teaching science, you want to maybe go back and say, okay, well, what are some common words that are going to be coming up this week in this chapter or in this unit? Take that root and have the kids really do a deep dive. And the second page is the student recording sheet. So we can pick one word, we can do multiple words. And again, you can, as a content area teacher, really formulate it around what you're going to be teaching. So again, point is this is not just an ELA practice. I think especially in science, math, social studies, where they are coming upon these big words that they've probably never seen before, it really helps to stress the explicit teaching of root words, especially Greek and Latin ones, so that they can have that in their back pocket, know what the root is, so when they come across complex words in the future, they have the skills to decode them. So again, you will get access to these handouts in the resource document that we share after the webinar. And again, for those of you who just joined us, it's so nice to have you. If you do have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box, and my colleague Amory will be answering those as we go. All right, another root cause of literacy gaps is limited access to grade level and complex texts. And I taught high school English, and I was definitely a person who would do this often, where we, instead of scaffolding, we are simplifying. And I was definitely guilty of that while I was teaching. So a lot of times when we have students who are below level of where they should be, we tend to over scaffold, which removes the productive struggle, right? We say, okay, here, you know what, read this Cliff Notes version of the text or this shortened or summarized version of the text, instead of giving students the opportunity to have that productive struggle with a complex text. We know research shows us that students grow by working with grade level material. The challenge, that challenging piece, that's supporting the challenge, that's where kids are going to grow. And we know in the real world, once they graduate, nobody's going to be simplifying or summarizing things for them. They need to be able to have the skills to grapple with whatever text is in front of them. So if you look at the difference between scaffolding and simplifying, so what we want to do as educators is to scaffold. That means we want to support the kids in accessing that grade level text, versus simplifying, which so many of us are guilty of, reducing the complexity of the text itself. So if you look at the icon I have on the screen, simplifying is, replacing a text with a summary, taking out difficult words and substituting them with synonyms, removing challenging sentences, or just overall lowering your expectations for what your students at grade level should be reading. Whereas scaffolding, we're using different strategies. We're chunking the text, we're pre-teaching keywords, we're modeling, we're using think alouds, we're using guided questions. And I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of those strategies shortly and how you can implement them in your own classes. The goal is you can keep the rigor of grade level texts as long as you provide the support your students need, and that's what's going to help them to grow. So in terms of complex text, and it's hard, right? Because we've all have those. I remember having whole classes of students who were below level. And it's hard to say, oh my gosh, we have to read Macbeth. How are my kids going to read Macbeth when we're so below level? We know that giving the kids access to those complex texts, even if it is a struggle, as long as we provide them with the right support, they will build vocabulary and knowledge. They will be better prepared for college or whatever post-secondary career they go into. They'll develop their analytical thinking skills and overall just strengthen their stamina and fluency. No one expects us to hand a 3-grade below level reader a copy of Macbeth and say, here, go home and I want analysis by tomorrow. There's lots of strategies that we can use as teachers to keep them on grade level text, grappling with complex text, but scaffolding it to meet their needs. So I'm going to talk about 2 of those and 2 of my favorite ones and 2 very easy ones to work with in any content area: clarifying and chunking. So in terms of clarifying, the goal of that is to set a purpose for reading, right? What is the focus question? What am I looking for as a student as I am reading? So it might be identify the theme. What's the main argument? What's an example of evidence? What's the scientific process being explained? You're just giving the students a goal in mind for reading. So instead of you telling them, hey, I need you to read chapter 3, you're going to be a little more specific. As you read, track how the author develops the central claim about justice. So now they're looking through a very specific lens of, I know I'm looking for a claim and I know I'm looking for justice. And the real goal of this is they don't have to hold everything. They're not trying to hold on to every single word of what they read, because they're not sure what you're going to ask them about later. They read with direction. You get to keep the full text, but we're reducing the student's cognitive overload. Another strategy that's really helpful when we're talking about using complex text is chunking the text. So you chunk the text, you don't get rid of the complexity. So you take, let's say it's a 6-paragraph text that you're reading for whatever content area. You can break the text into manageable sections, pause for processing, teach the students how to annotate, summarize, hold discussions. You don't have to sit there and read all 6 paragraphs in one shot. So we're not going to rewrite the section or give them a summary of the section. They're going to read the actual complex text. We're just pacing it. So read 1 paragraph, let's stop, discuss, share your annotations, turn and talk, and then you continue that way. It's just another way to scaffold so that students are processing, and they're processing deeply with the complex grade level text, just in smaller sections. We're not asking them to read the whole thing because then they might skim it. They might just look for keywords. We're forcing them to grapple with that full paragraph and engage in it in an analytical way. Another strategy that we can use for, just really honing in on literacy gaps, especially when it comes to reading, is using text-dependent questions. Text-dependent questions, they require students to interact directly with the complex language in those texts. So a good text-dependent question, you have to have read the text and you need to have understood the text in order to answer it, which means you have to be able to find evidence. You can actually do a wide variety of things with text-dependent questions. They can be literal, they can be analytical, they can be synthesizing, they can be evaluative, but they're not opinion-based or solely opinion-based. And I'm going to give some examples in a second. You can use those questions to focus on word choice, a sentence, a paragraph as a whole, or themes. And you can really hone in on difficult parts of the text. So one of the things that when I was teaching, right before we read something new, especially informational text, because that was where my students struggled, I would say, okay, which paragraph are they going to struggle the most with when we read this because of challenging concepts or difficult vocabulary? And that's the one I would really hone in on with a lot of text-dependent questions and a lot of close reading strategies. So if you think about how you want to formulate text-dependent questions, it could be anywhere from part of the text to the whole text. So a general understanding of what does this word mean, or what does this sentence explain, to what is the overall opinion or argument presented in the text as a whole. So you do have a lot of different ways you can approach this. So a lot of times people say, well, what's the difference? Like, how do I know if it's a text-dependent question versus a non-text-dependent question? So if you look at the samples on the slide right now, a non-text-dependent question does not require that you have read or understood the text. It might still discuss the text. It mentions the title of the text. It might mention a theme of the text, but it's purely opinion-based. So for example, in Letter from Birmingham Jail, Dr. King discusses nonviolent protest. Discuss in writing a time when you wanted to fight against something that you felt was unfair. That question does not require that the students understood anything about what they read. It's just asking them to make a connection between an event that happened in the text and something in their own life. Whereas a better version of that is text dependent, what can you infer from Dr. King's letter about the letter that he received? So really, if you didn't read or you didn't understand everything, you're going to have a really challenging time answering that question. Another example, in Gettysburg Address, Lincoln says the nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Why is equality an important value to promote? Again, purely opinion, even though it references the text. Whereas the Gettysburg Address mentions the year 1776, according to Lincoln's speech, why is this year significant to the events described in the speech? So again, we want it to be specific, and we want them to be able to show those analytical and inference skills while they're answering the questions. Another one of the resources you will get after this webinar are some text-dependent sample question starters. And I think this is really helpful for those of you who are administrators to give to your teachers. For those of you who are classroom teachers, you can use these in any content area for any grade level. And it just kind of helps you formulate better questions that are forcing the kids to grapple with those complex texts. Another strategy, accountable talk. You can build on text-dependent questioning by providing students with sentence stems. And these sentence stems that I'm going to share and a bulletin board set will also be shared in the resources after the webinar. These sentence stems really help students practice their academic reasoning skills instead of just having the thinking done for them. So it's just stems, not complete, hey, I want you to regurgitate this sentence or this paragraph. So we know that complex texts require complex thinking. So the rigor can remain high, but we're going to increase the support we give our students. So accountable talk stems, they do a couple of different things. One, they help scaffold academic language. So if you're thinking about your students having a discussion or writing an essay or answering questions, and you ask, okay, what is the author's main point? Without support, it might be, I think the author's kind of saying this. However, if we could provide them with talk stems, it gives them a very specific frame. The author suggests blank because blank. It helps the thinking become clearer, more precise, and gives students confidence to participate and know that they have an accurate sentence stem to work with. They also help build confidence and identity. So if you provide students with a way to begin, a structure, a model of academic thinking, because that's what accountable talk stems are, over time, they increase student independence, they normalize academic conversation, and they build academic identity. Because again, we're not asking them to start from scratch. We're giving them the scaffolds they need to have those academic conversations. Accountable talk stems, they keep students grounded in the text. They prevent off-topic discussion. They reinforce close reading, which we know is super important for complex texts, and they strengthen text-based reasoning. So if we look at some of the samples that you'll be getting in your handout, if we're asking them to state an opinion, this is a question you might ask. If we're asking them to answer an opinion-based question, these are some stems they could use. I've gone to multiple classrooms where we've had the students have copies of these and they've kept them in their notebook, or we've put them up as anchor charts on the wall. Again, it just promotes that consistency of this is how we have, accountable conversations. This is how we have text-based conversations. And again, this is something you can do in any content area. Another gap that a lot of students seem to have that is affecting literacy in secondary is vocabulary background and knowledge gaps. So with vocabulary, we know that comprehension strategies alone are not sufficient to just help kids read. They need to be able to gain that background knowledge, even if they don't already have it, and they need to be able to build vocabulary skills. So literacy gaps typically stem from tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary deficits or limited exposure to academic language. So just to kind of compare, when we talk about tier 2 vocabulary and tier 3 vocabulary, tier 2 vocabulary are those high utility academic words across content areas. You see them on standardized tests, analyze, contrast, compare, words that are very common, but not in students' necessary everyday language. So they are academic based, but not content specific. Whereas tier 3 words are content specific, photosynthesis, impeachment, stuff that's specific to science, social studies, art. You probably wouldn't use it in a conversation unless you were talking about those content area specific topics. But you can tell the kids who struggle with tier 2, they usually don't understand directions. They have a hard time understanding what you're asking them to do if the directions include academic words. They often misinterpret prompts, especially on standardized tests, what the writing prompt is asking them to do, what the question's asking them to do. They often give vague responses due to a lack of understanding, and they avoid complex discussion because they don't have that tier 2 vocabulary knowledge. Whereas your tier 3 strugglers, they usually are having a hard time with content specific stuff. They'll avoid the textbook, they misunderstand core concepts of that content area, or they might misinterpret or struggle with a discipline-specific task. It's the main point is you cannot comprehend what you do not know. So how do we help these students improve their tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary and background knowledge? So when we talk about improving tier 2 knowledge, that is, again, your academic based vocabulary. This is stuff that regardless of if I teach English or math or science or art, we use these words all the time, just academic based words. You absolutely have to do this through repetition. These are words that would be great for a word wall. These are words that you should have students saying out loud. You're using it orally. They're writing them in context because we know repetition builds ownership and understanding. A lot of times, especially with my multilingual learners, I would have student-friendly definitions of these words in addition to the dictionary definitions up on my word wall, give examples and non-examples, and most importantly is to use them across multiple contexts. So if I'm a building administrator and I'm really trying to close that literacy gap, I might do a word of the week for every department. The word of the week is contrast. And I want every single content area, regardless of whether you're math, ELA, phys ed, health, whatever you're teaching, contrast is the word of the week. And that's the word we really want to solidify and make sure every student in this building knows what the word means by the end of the week. What does it mean and what does it look like in ELA versus science versus history? In terms of tier 3, so tier 3 is your more academic vocabulary. A really helpful strategy is to pre-teach vocabulary words. So if you're going to be reading a text in whatever content area, as the teacher, I would go through that text first and identify 3 to 6 high leverage words. High leverage meaning if the kids don't understand these words, they are going to miss a key part of the text and it's going to affect their comprehension. What you can do is teach that meaning briefly and then revisit them during reading. That's the very easy way to pre-teach vocabulary. Just make sure they identify the words, what do they mean, and then you revisit them. Hey, this is the word we talked about before. Now, what does it mean in context? Super simple strategy. Why do we need to do that? We don't want students to be decoding words and comprehending concepts at the same time. We want to arm them with all the scaffolds they need to be able to read effectively. And if you know there's going to be high leverage words in that text that are going to be a challenge for your students, a helpful scaffold is to pre-teach them. What we don't want to do is give them long vocabulary lists to study. If here are 15 words, we're going to use this unit and there's going to be a test. Again, think chunking, small lists, 3 to 6 per text. We don't want them just to be doing isolated dictionary.com work. We don't want to replace the academic words with easier synonyms. We want them, again, to grapple with the complex language that is grade level appropriate. So the goal of pre-teaching vocabulary, we want to increase student access, again, so they're not grappling with both a complex text and decoding meanings of words. We're maintaining the rigor for grade level. And then we're also supporting their independence and we're able to show those connections directly to the text. So this was the word we pre-taught. This was the definition we came up with. Now let's look at it in the text. And now let's figure out what does it mean in the text because they already have that base knowledge. Now with background knowledge gaps, sometimes this can be a challenge, especially with students who maybe are coming from different countries or just had, general, different types of lifestyles, growing up. Not everybody is going to necessarily have the same level of background knowledge as everybody else. And we know that background knowledge is one of the strongest predictors of comprehension. If I give my students a text about, let's say a sport, and it's a sport that they've never heard of, that's going to require some pre-teaching before I can expect them to understand what the text is about. So to close any literacy gaps, we have to build that knowledge intentionally and not just teach the strategies. So ways you can do that: read multiple texts on the same topic, varying length and varying format so they can grow their background knowledge on the topic. You can use short, accessible companion texts. We can anchor learning with visuals, maps, infographics, photographs. We can teach cultural and historical references explicitly. It's like mini lessons, slide decks, videos. Basically, what do you need to know before we talk about this topic? So, quick classroom routine: show an image, teach 3 vocabulary words, provide 3 essential facts, ask a prediction question, and then you read the real text. So it doesn't have to be days of pre-teaching background knowledge and vocabulary before you start a text. That's not reasonable. It's not realistic. We don't have that kind of time as teachers. I'll tell you the biggest issue I ever had with teaching background knowledge was when I taught the Crucible to my students, because my students had no knowledge of McCarthyism or the Salem witch trials. So I had to give a good amount of background knowledge. And what I did was I turned my classroom into a walking museum. And we had pictures of, photographs from the McCarthy era. We had pictures and documents from the Salem witch trials. And I did had to spend about a whole period just pre-teaching the history, because if they have no knowledge whatsoever on any of the topics that are going to be covered, we cannot expect them to understand or comprehend what they're going to be reading. So depending on the topic, depending on what your reading is going to be about, you can absolutely get away with a quick classroom routine. If it's something, about AI or about cell phones or about, something that we know that there's a good amount of background knowledge on. If it's something historically specific, scientifically specific, you may have to go into a little more depth. But the key takeaway is we don't want to assume students, well, they should already know that, and I don't have to pre-teach it. We don't want to replace the complex text with summaries. We don't want to over front load so that then there's no need for them to read the actual text. And we don't want to treat knowledge gaps as deficits. They are opportunity gaps. We want to take the opportunity to teach our children the background knowledge and the vocabulary they need so that they can grapple with complex texts. So if you think about the progression, knowledge builds vocabulary, vocabulary builds comprehension, comprehension builds confidence. So you have to root your teaching to close that literacy gap, root it in background knowledge and vocabulary, and then you can move on from there. All right, another gap causer is motivation, identity, and academic confidence. So by middle school and high school, students aren't just struggling with reading, they're struggling with what does reading say about them. So there's also an emotional weight that comes with these literacy gaps. Students who struggle, they're often embarrassed when they're asked to read out loud. They're afraid of being found out that they're a bad reader. They avoid reading, which can honestly a lot of times be seen as disengagement. They skip reading tests, they act out, they over rely on their peers, or they really need summaries. But reader identity is something that, like I said, has an emotional weight to it. It's shaped by representation, past experiences, classroom culture. And we know that if students can improve their reader identity, that it drives engagement more than just ability. So whether or not we would deem them a good reader doesn't matter as much as if they have a positive reader identity. So literacy growth is not just academic. It also is in part of self-perception. So self-perception plays a large part in reader identity, which can contribute to a literacy gap if it's on the negative. So keeping in mind that reading avoidance is not always a lack of effort. Sometimes it's a coping strategy, and it is really important to interpret behavior as a signal that may be signaling causes and roots of the literacy gap. So avoiding disengagement, and it's hard because students aren't always disengaged because of literacy gap issues. Sometimes it's other things. But disengagement is often the final stage of repeated academic frustration. So there is a cycle that is involved in this, because when students struggle repeatedly, they sometimes stop trying because they're afraid of failing. They participate less in discussion. They only complete the bare minimum of the work, and definitely not on an analytical or grade level appropriate, task. So if you look at the downward spiral of disengagement, we go from struggle to frustration to avoidance, less practice to wider gaps. So it is crucial that we interrupt that cycle early. So disengagement is often, it's the outcome of unmet needs, not a lack of ability. So that's why all these scaffolding strategies that I've been presenting are super important, because our goal as educators is to move students back toward confidence through supporting and success. So confidence is built, it's not assumed. A lot of that has to do with classroom culture. A lot of it has to do with giving students opportunities and to succeed through scaffolding, like accountable talk stems, vocabulary building, background knowledge building. So some of the things that you can do, normalizing struggle, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, providing some of the scaffolds that we discussed prior, and creating low risk participation opportunities. So giving those accountable talk stems, having them work in smaller groups versus large group discussion, giving them all the opportunities they have to engage in complex thinking with complex texts that will help avoid that downward spiral of disengagement. So one of the things you absolutely can do in your classroom or in your school as a whole is to engage in activities and thinking that promote a growth mindset. So just to kind of make sure that we're all on the same page, a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Fixed mindset is I'm born this way, you know, my abilities, my talent, my intelligence, they are fixed traits and I'm never going to change, right? If you have a fixed mindset, you're more likely to not engage in risks, give minimal effort, be afraid of challenges. And then your goal kind of becomes to look smart all the time. And this way you're not caught or not found out. Whereas the goal is growth mindset. Your beliefs, your talents, your abilities, they can be developed through effort, through good teaching, through persistence. The individual differences are there, but everyone can get smarter, better if they work at it. And that mind shift only happens through success and not necessarily just saying, oh, yes, you know, you're a good person or keep trying. Like we absolutely have to work on it and we have to incorporate it into our daily classroom and school culture. So if the goal is promoting a growth mindset, we want to always be encouraging students to expand their answers, being able to explain that real life application, avoiding, you know, just praising intelligence. We want to, you know, make sure that we're really looking at not just, oh, hey, you did a good job, or hey, you're super smart, but we're looking at the growth. You may not have mastered this yet, but you're getting there because you did A, B, or C. Giving students a chance to struggle without going back down that spiral where they struggle and then fail, giving them the scaffolds to struggle and work towards success, and explicitly teaching growth mindset. And I think that's a big key because I don't think you can walk into a middle school class or a high school class and say, hey, I want you to have a growth mindset, because I don't think kids are necessarily going to know what that means. So another activity that you're going to get a copy of is a growth mindset activity. It has a great TED Talk video attached to it that you can show to students. And then it's really having them reframe that language in their head that says, I'm terrible at this. Well, okay, I'm not good at this yet, but I can learn. So really just reframing their language. Because if you think about it, big picture, your approach pushes your students either towards or further away from a growth mindset. So what you do and what you model in the classroom is going to determine that. All right, let's talk about ways to rebuild motivation and identity. So we know that strength-based literacy instruction restores skill and belonging. So some other things that you can be doing to kind of rebuild student motivation, promote growth mindset, avoid that disengagement spiral. We can offer choice and relevance in texts. We can give the kids grade level rigorous options on what they are reading. We can provide structured success with grade level work. Again, scaffolding that work so they get the scaffolds they need when they need them until they don't need them anymore, but keeping the rigor and the text complexity on grade level. Using discussion before writing to reduce the pressure. I know a lot of students, and I'm going to talk about writing more in a minute, a lot of students have a fear of writing because they're afraid that they're not good writers. So helping students to scaffold that writing by having a class or peer discussion prior can really be helpful. And celebrate strategy use, not speed. So it's not how fast you write that essay. It's not how fast you read the text. It's, are you using the appropriate strategies to help you understand your writing or your reading? So if you think about big picture, we don't motivate students by lowering the rigor or the expectations. We motivate them by making success possible with the expected rigor of work. And I think that really is the key takeaway when we think about increasing motivation, improving reader and writer identity. We don't want to dumb it down for them. We want to give them the supports they need so that they can achieve grade level work. All right, so what I just mentioned were a whole lot of classroom-based strategies for all content areas. So now I want to take a minute and look at school-wide supports as a whole. So if you're a building administrator, these are things that you can be doing top-down to kind of promote literacy across the content areas and across your building. So one of my biggest suggestions is aligning practices across the content areas, especially with reading, because in every single content area, they are doing some type of reading. Whether it's a textbook, it's articles, informational texts, there's always reading involved. Literacy cannot live in one department. We know that students will benefit when expectations are consistent, and we also know that collaboration reduces fragmentation. So if we're using similar or the same strategies across the classes, regardless of content area, that will only support students' comprehension and will absolutely help to close that literacy gap. So some of the things we can do across the content areas are things I already mentioned, vocabulary routines, maybe doing that word of the week across all content areas, maybe picking a tier 2 academic word that everybody focuses on, once a month or once a week. Accountable talk, promoting text-based evidence, the strategies that I shared before. Common literary devices, and this is another handout that you will get access to in your resource sheet. Are we making sure that our non-ELA teachers are still using literary devices? Are they still teaching about paradox or juxtaposition, analogies, making sure that we are using a common language across the content areas, because that only increases the rigor that everybody is expected to achieve at. Other ways that you can promote collaboration across the content areas, we can do common writing expectations, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. We can do PLC data meetings. We can do vertical articulation. We can have cross-content literacy goals. I know when I was teaching, my district did a district-wide, everybody had to be writing in the classroom once a month, whether it was health, art, science, everybody was responsible for writing an essay or something of an equivalent once a month, regardless of content area. And then we had to have interdisciplinary projects where ELA had to pair up with another content area to do one interdisciplinary project a month. So there's lots of different ways you can help align literacy practices so that it is not just an ELA issue. It has to be a school-wide responsibility. Aligning writing expectations, similar to aligning, reading protocols, we can absolutely create school-wide or district-wide writing requirements and processes. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It doesn't mean everybody in your building has to go take a master's, course on writing. It can be as simple as, are all content areas teaching a variety of writing types? So in social studies, are they expected to write just persuasive essays all the time? Or are they sometimes writing narratives? Are they sometimes writing expository essays? And then also one thing that you absolutely can do to align everybody is everybody teaches the same writing process. You could come up with a school-wide or district-wide graphic organizer that every content area uses every time you're writing. You're going to go through this process. You're going to use this graphic organizer because, again, we know that alignment and collaboration supports growth. And now we also have to think about tiering, right? Because we definitely are going to have students who need more support besides the tier 1 scaffolding that teachers are already going to do. So we absolutely need to use our data to guide instruction, not to replace it. We want to focus on patterns and not just single scores, because the question is, what skill is missing? So we're going to use our data to identify needs, not to label the students. So we can use our universal screeners, we can use classroom assessments, we can use benchmarks, we can use writing samples, observation notes. It doesn't have to be anything officially formal, but we do want to give multiple content areas the ability to look at data and say, okay, I can see that both in social studies, science, and ELA, that this student struggles with spelling or this student struggles with whatever. And so now we're looking for, okay, that's the skill that needs to be the focus of any kind of tiered intervention that we're going to move forth with. We don't want to do excessive testing. We can absolutely use the assessments that we're giving in class and look for specific missing skills. but we do want to be having that progress monitoring consistently. And we want to be strategic about how we're doing it so that we can, again, pull out what skill is missing. So if you're doing any kind of multi-tiered structure in your school, we know that tier one is the most powerful point, right? What happens in the class. So that is your everyday instruction. That is using the best practices that I've already mentioned to scaffold for literacy. Secondary intervention has to be skill specific. We have to look at what is the gap and then what types of interventions can we provide that speak to that specific gap. A lot of times, like I mentioned, it's foundational support, but it's also grade level texts at the same time. So it might not be one thing. We're not just going to focus on phonics. There might be multiple areas. So if there's a gap in decoding skills, then we need to look at explicit phonics instruction. If there's a vocabulary gap, we need to look at teaching tier 2 and tier 3. So we definitely have to look at what is the cause, and then it's not just reading help. It's not just study hall. It's making sure we're creating tiered interventions that speak specifically to the gap itself. So when we talk about tier 2 and tier 3, when we talk about tier 3 and tier 3 support, that's your small group, skill specific. I have these 6 kids in grade 7 who are all struggling with phonics. So that's going to be my phonics focus group. Whereas tier 3 is, okay, we've tried tier 2, they need more help. That's very highly targeted. It's one-to-one. It's more frequent. So it might be, daily, every other day. And it's again, very individualized support. It's not extra homework help. It's not tutoring. It's not test prep. It's not the kids just need more reading time. It's not a study hall. It is a very specific skill-based intervention. And tier 2 versus tier 3 just really determines how structured, how often, and how individualized it needs to be. So another document that you're going to have access to in the resource sheet is tier 2 and tier 3 strategies based on gap. So if you look at the slide right now, if the student or group of students have word recognition gaps, there are different ideas for types of tier 2 strategies you can use versus types of tier 3 strategies you can use. And there's about 3 pages of this, and there's all different gaps and potential strategies that you can adapt and try to fit the needs of your students. Okay, well, I really appreciate you listening to me, and I hope you got some helpful strategies. So let's recap the main points here. Literacy is not just an ELA issue, it is a school-wide responsibility. Older students can and do make significant literacy gains with the right supports and scaffolding. Addressing the gap requires instruction, tier 1 scaffolded instruction, not just remediation alone. So let's talk about what you're going to get at the conclusion of this webinar. So over the next few days, you will get a resource sheet that has hyperlinked all the different activities and strategies I demonstrated for you today. And I'm hoping that you can, use them for your school, for your classroom to help close that literacy gap. If you still need more support, we do a lot of support for literacy and not just in the ELA classroom. How to support literacy in the content areas as well. We have a variety of professional development workshops, science of reading for secondary classrooms, scaffolding writing, MTSS, and we also do coaching and PLC support as well. So happy to chat with you about that. My email address is on there, jaclyn.siano@inspiredinstruction.com. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you do need more support. And if you have any other questions that you need to put in the chat, feel free to do that now and I will answer them. If not, I appreciate it. The recording will be available to you and I hope you found this helpful.